And so next we have Salem Avan, again apologies if I've mispronounced anything, who is currently the Director of Policy, Strategy and Governance Division for ICT at the United Nations. And the goal is to enable the UN Secretariat to deliver effectively on its mandate through the secure, responsible and innovative use of data, information and technology. With that, I'd like to welcome Salem onto the stage.
Thank you. Are you guys all from the UK, or more or less all from the UK? Scotland? So can I use my proper accent? Yeah, because I've had 25 to 30 years of a fake accent at the UN because nobody understands what I'm saying most of the time. So what I'm going to tell you, so I thought about this and I thought about the idea of sustainability and open source, and I'm not really going to talk too much about open source because I think that's something that, there's plenty of other people that can talk about, but I want to talk a little bit about my experience, my kind of path and journey, the kind of UN, what the UN is, what it means, a little bit about the SDGs, and then I can kind of try to articulate the challenges that I see as the biggest challenges. Does that kind of sort of make sense? I kind of just came up with this morning. So I was born in the UK, in the Gorbals in Glasgow. I ended up, for whatever reason, in the former Yugoslavia. Some of you might be old enough to remember there was a war there in 1993-ish kind of area. And then from there, I ended up going from Croatia to Bosnia to Iraq to Western Sahara to Sierra Leone, West Africa to East Africa, and I kind of dotted around the place, and I ended up doing a whole bunch of peacekeeping missions before I realized that that wasn't really sustainable, that I was aging in dog years, and every 3 years seemed to be like one. And so I decided I should go somewhere else, so I ended up going to New York. And I've been in New York for now almost 15 to 20 years working at the UN, and it's always kind of been in technology, and at the moment I kind of take care of everything in technology that isn't operational. So anything related to policy, strategy, governance, obviously, things like innovation, open source, data, those are the sorts of areas that I'm responsible for. So I want to tell you a little bit about the history of the UN. You guys have all heard of the UN. It was founded when? 1945, close. So it was founded in 1945. It was founded immediately after the Second World War. I think that we, humanity, had that moment where we thought, this is really, really bad, what happened. And so member states came together and created the UN. At that time, there was 51 member states that came together and signed the charter. Everybody showed up for the charter except Poland. I don't know why Poland didn't come. Maybe they had a dental appointment, but they didn't come. They signed it in absenteeism. So it was signed in San Francisco. And now we have 193 member states that have signed the charter. So that's pretty much every country that we have, minus a few kind of nations that we don't really kind of think of as having full statehood. So the UN started in 1945, and it started with this basic principle, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. And the four kind of main issues that the UN was tackling at that time were international law, human rights, peace and security, and development. Post-Second World War, it kind of makes sense, right? So after the Second World War, obviously you're interested in international law and reaffirming it, interest in development, because now you've had a war and you've got to develop, peace and security, obviously, and human rights, because it was massive violations of human rights. At that time, climate, sustainability was not a thing. Nobody knew, nobody thought about it, nobody really kind of gave it any mind at all. We trundled along in the UN probably for about, I'm going to say, 40 to 50 years, and the main focus continued to be peace and security with some development. We had 48 to 50 peacekeeping missions, and around about the mid-90s, we realized that basically for every 3 peacekeeping missions that we undertook at significant cost, 1 seemed to work and 2 didn't really work. So 2/3 of peacekeeping missions weren't really successful. So we kind of came to this idea of integration, and what we basically realized is this, that you can't get people to care about human rights or development or the climate or judicial systems or humanitarian affairs or water security if you don't have peace and security. And so what we kind of realized is that all of these things need to be tackled in an integrated way. And so this concept came along of kind of integrated approach to I guess, the UN's work, to peace and security, to sustainability. And what happened in that moment was that the organization sort of took a much more holistic approach to the kind of entire spectrum of the work that we were charged to do. Now, the reason I mentioned that is because while we talk about sustainability, climate change, we talk about, net zero, 1.5, we can't disassociate those concepts from the concepts of water security, from the concepts of development, from peace and security, from human rights, from humanitarian affairs. All of them are fundamentally connected. Does that kind of make sense in principle? Yeah. And that's not to say that we have to boil the ocean and tackle all of those things at once, but it is to say that when we think about sustainability, it can't just be about that one sort of single solitary kind of aspect of the work that we need to do. When we talk about sustainability, and I think, do you guys think about like the climate and environment when we use the word sustainability? Yeah. Okay, so I don't. So when I think about sustainability, I think about the SDGs, right? The goals for sustainable, 2030 goals for sustainable development. So I think about the entire spectrum, right? And the entire spectrum contains like 17 goals. And if you guys remember, some of you might be old enough to remember, but we had a Secretary General called Kofi Annan. Yeah, that was probably about, 25 years ago. And he came up with the precursor to the SDGs, which was the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals were 8 goals that were really focused on key kind of human aspirations at that time. And they started in 2020, and they were supposed to go till 2015. We had 8 of them. We succeeded in achieving 3. On 5 of them, we didn't succeed. Subsequent to that, and actually, tomorrow is the anniversary. So on the 15th of September 2015, after the quote mark success of the MDGs, we decided to establish the SDGs. SDGs, if you haven't heard of them, I'm sure you have, but they cover peace and security, gender, they cover life on water, life in water, life on land, education, all sorts of different aspects. So it's that kind of whole, kind of much more coherent aspect of development, sustainable development. Unfortunately, of the 17 goals that we established, and those goals were slightly different because they were really established by the member states today, and we're already 8 years into 15 years, right? So tomorrow will be the anniversary of when they were conceived. 30% of those 17 goals either show no progress or regression since 2015. So I think that fundamentally we can sort of quite clearly see that much of the efforts that are underway are not necessarily working. Now, both the MDGs and the SDGs suffer from the idea that they've got to be implemented globally, and there's many member states that aren't able to implement them because they've got much more pressing issues to deal with. They've got much bigger problems with, actually now, more and more climate change, with peace and security issues. They've got human rights issues, they've got economic issues, and so on and so forth. So in all of that, and I'm going to come to open source, one of the things that we, the UN, have identified is that technology has a really pivotal role to play, and it has a potentially catalytic role in trying to advance, sustainability, all of the issues related to climate, and all of the ancillary issues related to peace and security, human rights, so on and so forth. But we also recognize that the majority of technology, as we understand it, is not accessible to the majority of the world. So whilst there's an increasing penetration of technology globally, there still is a massive digital divide all over the place. And when you take gender into consideration, that digital divide is even greater. So arguably some of the most vulnerable people, some of the most disenfranchised people don't have the benefit of technology. What we have sort of seen in the last, I guess, 3 to 5 years, and particularly the pandemic has been kind of interesting in changing things, is the World Health Organization saw a 50% growth in the use of telehealth and telemedicine as a result of the pandemic. So to me, does that mean that we can now use telehealth and those sorts of technologies to provide care to more and more people? I think that's one of the things that we really need to fundamentally think about. Similarly, the World Bank, World Bank estimated that as of today, there's still almost 1 billion people that don't have any proof of their identity. So these are the sorts of issues that when we think about sustainability, think about some of the ancillary aspects, we have to think about how do we overcome some of these issues. ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, talked about the fact that now 66% of people are online, but when it comes to least developed countries, the number is only 36%. Whilst we have all of these challenges, and whilst we have all these disparities in the world, and whilst we have, us talking about sustainability and climate and those sorts of issues, we have another 192 member states out there that are dealing with entirely different issues. And when we think about that, and we think about the use of technology, the potential of data, technology, hardware, software, open source is, to me, a real kind of bastion, a real positive element where we can really kind of try to anchor some of the work that we do. So we see, for example, we looked at the Linux Foundation, the projects they've undertaken, and they themselves, in the context of those projects, have written or implemented 115 million lines of code, and that was in 2015, representing over 42,000 years of person hours. Similarly, 70% of startups sort of recognize open source as a critical part of their development, and Moodle is being used in over 200 countries, and OpenMRS, which is a health database, is being used in 40. We recently undertook an implementation in India to train teachers, and we trained 250,000 teachers using a Moodle platform. So I think there's an enormous amount of potential there that we can try to leverage and really kind of engage on together. The UN also recognizes this. So the UN has many kind of pillars. It has the Security Council, which deals with peace and security, and it has the ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Council, which deals with development, social and economic development. So in 2021, the ECOSOC issued a resolution which not only identified the importance of open source, but it recognized the necessity of supranational capacity in OS, meaning that it's okay and important for individual countries to establish capacity in OS, but it's more important that we're able to establish that capacity across nation and across the boundaries of individual states. And many of the issues that we deal with when it comes to technology as a whole, open source, data, transcend the kind of sovereign concept of sovereignty, the concept of boundaries. And then they also talked a lot about leveraging existing open source technology for development and how we could do that. So I think there's certainly appetite and engagement and possibility for the UN to work on these sorts of issues. We really need to kind of think of that in this kind of larger concept of partnerships. And I'm going to sort of come back to that in just a second. I worry a little bit that we have all of these really interesting technologies appearing, like generative AI and quantum computing. They're very much on the horizon. I don't know if they're going to be available to everyone. I really don't. I don't think they will. I think they'll be in the hands of a few. I also wonder what they'll be used for. Will they be used in the context of trying to solve the biggest problems that we face as humanity? Will they be used in the context of climate, environment, sustainability? I think they will, but I don't know at what level, and I think that's something that we really need to think about and engage on. So we, when it comes to open source, probably 3 years ago weren't particularly interested or engaged in open source, but since then we've established a dedicated team and we've established a strategy to look at open source. So we're looking at basically 3 pillars for open source. They're fairly intuitive. The first one is really to think about the legal advocacy aspects of open source, not just for the UN, but also for member states. So whilst there are some member states, the UK being a very good example, that are very advanced in these sorts of areas, at a national level, there's a massive number of member states that haven't even thought about this, and they haven't thought about the options, opportunities, and possibilities for open source for their own use. Whilst they're not thinking about it, what's happening is, for example, other member states are going to them and saying, how about if we create a capacity for you? The only caveat is it'll be staffed by our nationals in your country, which is troubling. Or you've got private sector entities that are going to these member states and saying, that's absolutely fine, we can manage your sanitation systems, we can deal with telemedicine, health, we can deal with climate, with your SDG commitments, environment, etc. But we just need to sell you the software, and then basically, once that kind of cycle starts, it becomes extremely difficult for these smaller member states to get out of that cycle. That's kind of pillar one, is really about policy and the legal framework of open source for the UN and for member states. Pillar two is going to focus on internal capacity and culture. One of the initiatives is called Mind the Gap. I tried to tell my team very politely that has particular connotations in the UK, but things don't translate real well in the UN. And so we just stuck with it, and I thought, what could possibly go wrong? So we're just going with Mind the Gap, but it's really this idea of trying to do a whole bunch of workshops and try to raise awareness of open source in the UN, and we invite you to kind of engage with us on that. Also, we have a community of practice in Pillar 2, which is about we call open source heroes, really about trying to bring like-minded people together. It's relatively small. I think we have, 300 to 500 people, but it's something that we want to grow, and we invite you to look at that and to learn more. And the third pillar, which I think is the most interesting one, is about not only creating an open source platform where we can put some of the kind of solutions that we need for member states and vet those, but we also have hackathons under the kind of branding of open source software or open source technology for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to just talk about a couple more things before I close. So when we talk about solutions and when we talk about trying to support member states, I'm going to announce a Reboot Accelerator initiative that we're doing with Open UK at the end. But just to give you a little context, one of the things that we did in 2019 in the Youth Environment Summit was we established this thing called Reboot the Earth. And Reboot the Earth was a global hackathon. Okay? And the global hackathon was really intended to bring ideas, bring people, bring the open source community, the open source spirit together to try and support the UN in some of the challenges that we face. So the core UN has a smaller budget than the New York City Fire Department. But the mandate's obviously a lot bigger. So I think that the UN as an institution has a particular role to play, but I don't think it has the capacity that it needs to deal with the challenges that it has to deal with. I don't think the UN as an entity has the ability to deal with global peace and security, climate, environment, net zero, any of those sorts of issues. But I do think through partnership, we can achieve that. So Reboot the Earth, there was two examples I want to give you about Reboot the Earth, and we're going to be doing a similar one with Open UK. So the first one was, we had a model for electrification for Africa. And the model was based on one 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer squares that Africa was broken into. And each one had a significant amount of data pertaining to the infrastructure, the demographics, and the meteorological information, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was to try and find a way to implement or give member states a configuration of clean technology in order to achieve electrification that was environmentally suitable, and then to associate a cost with that. The model was established between us and, I guess, the kind of premier technology university in Sweden. When we ran the model, every time we ran the model, it took 50 hours to basically compute. It was a massive amount of data. So we did a hackathon, and we basically went to everybody and said, listen, this is our problem, this is the data set, et cetera, et cetera. And a young woman who lives in the US from India changed the algorithm by which we were running the computation. And instead of taking 50 hours, she reduced that to 5 minutes. Not only did she reduce it to 5 minutes, instead of having 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer squares, we had 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer squares. And we wrote her a letter from the SG to say thank you. And she said it was the proudest moment of her life. And you know, the reason I mention that is because when we find solutions to me can be about one of two things. They can be about finding an actual solution to a problem, as this example shows. She found a solution to a technical problem, and that solution was, to us, game-changing and really important. The second example I'm going to give you isn't about finding a solution, but it's about finding inspiration and bringing people together. So that's one example. The second example, which is kind of very close to my heart, is an example where we did Reboot the Earth Challenge. It was the first one. Diane at the back, who's accompanying me, actually ran that challenge. So if you want to talk to her, you can talk to her about that later. And we had a series of winners from around the world, okay? And they all came to New York. And to our surprise, the winner of the Reboot Challenge, I don't know how it happened, but that person ended up on stage with the Secretary General and Greta Thunberg talking about it. It was great. One of the entries was from this pair of young people. One was a Brit, one is Polish, about storing data in the DNA of plants and trees. It was called Grow Your Own Cloud. It was semi-technology, semi-art installation, semi-activist advocacy concept, where it, based on the notion, well, the fact that a significant amount of the DNA, and as you know, DNA is really just ones and zeros, right, when you look at it. Much of the DNA in plants, trees, etc., is spacers, not really relevant. Yeah? This is probably why, and I'm no geneticist, why we share apparently 98% of our DNA with fruit flies, right? A lot of it's just, so what they were able to do is encode data into the DNA of plants, and what they argued, and they're correct in this, is you could store all the world's data in liquid DNA form in something that is about the size of a pickup truck or an SUV. SUV? Does that make sense to you guys? A suburban utility vehicle, a Jeep, basically. Which I think is a very interesting solution, not necessarily because it's workable, but because it's quite inspirational and important. So I think this whole idea of hackathons is very, very important for us as we think about trying to solve these challenges, particularly when we think about that in the context of open source, which is really, to me, fundamentally associated with the principles of the UN. Two last things. So has anybody, you guys all have jobs, right? Something you do. Has anybody ever had that moment where you think, what am I doing and what am I doing it for? You have, yes. I think everybody has, right? I had one of those moments a few years ago. And working in the UN is not easy, right? It's not easy. And so I thought about this, and I really thought about, how do I figure this out? And so I happened to come across the UN Charter, okay? And the UN Charter, and this is something I want to really kind of leave you with in the context of open source and the conversation we're having here. And I think it was mentioned earlier by Leanne about this idea of coming together and you talked about all the different kind of areas and groups that need to come together in order to solve these challenges, right? So, UN Charter says, we the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war that has twice in our lifetimes brought untold suffering. Yeah? That's more or less exactly it, right? So first of all, it says, and I thought about this for a second. Am I okay on time? Yeah. Okay, so I thought about this for a second. So it says, we the peoples. So it doesn't talk about the institution because the institution wasn't created, right? It was the instrument by which we created the institution. So we the peoples is all of us, first of all. And that's important. And the UN, to me, is not an institution, it's not an organization, it's not a body, it's everybody, because that's how it started. So think about that. And then it says to save succeeding generations from which twice in our lifetime. It doesn't say to save us, because we went through this really bad thing twice, 2 world wars, and we don't want that anymore. It didn't even talk about those people. It only talked about the succeeding generations, i.e. your parents, yourselves, your children, and so on, right? And in that, I kind of realized that not only is the UN a collaborative effort and something that we reach out to all of you on, but it's something that embodies a responsibility that we should carry, just as our grandparents or great-grandparents had that responsibility that they never took on for themselves, but for us. So I would sort of encourage you to think about that in the context of the UN and not think of the UN as this one single entity out there in the world. And then rather think of it as something that to which you can contribute. The difficulty is, how do you do that? Okay, and I think through Open UK and through this challenge that we're going to be doing, I think that's one way to do it. I found myself in West Africa and Sierra Leone. We had captured some indicted war criminals. We couldn't put them in a jail in Sierra Leone, and so we had to put them on this tiny little island off the coast of West Africa and Sierra Leone, which none of you guys have been to. It's called Bunt Island. Very surprised if anybody's been there. So I went up to look at this island because I needed to put telecommunications in there. I was a young fella. I was about 25 years ago. Climbed up the tower without a harness, and the tower was a telecommunications tower, 30-meter high. Got to about like 80% of the top, came across a wasp's nest. And these are not like Scottish, like middle-class accounted wasps. These are Hell's Angels, West African, tropical wasps. Got to the top, sat there 10 minutes. Thought to myself, you got two choices. Choice number one, really kind of concern yourself about getting stung by the wasps and risk falling down. Or choice number two, ignore the wasps and come down. So I took the second choice, got stung 3 or 4 times, got down to the bottom safely. The reason I mention that is sometimes in life we find ourselves in a place where we don't have a good choice. And I think that as humanity, I think there are some challenges that we face right now which I think are kind of mirrored by that little kind of situation. I'm not sure we have a ton of brilliant choices. I think we have some real challenges with the environment and climate. I think we have some real challenges related to peace and security, to human rights, etc. And so I think we really need to kind of decide and commit to something that really kind of makes sense to us individually and is part of this kind of greater effort that we're undertaking. The last thing I want to announce is, as part of what we want to do in order to kind of really encourage engagement, we're going to do a Reboot the Earth challenge in partnership with Open UK. It's going to be on the idea of data centers and how we can do that more sustainably. Remember, it doesn't have to be a solution. It can be a solution or an idea that's inspirational. It can be a solution that's workable, has to scale, right? Those are the sorts of things that we really care about. And we're going to do that in October. And so we invite you all to engage with us through Open UK or with us directly, but we really kind of like the idea of working with Open UK on some of these sorts of challenges. And I know that you all have a connection to Open UK, so we kind of ask you to think about that, think about some of the things that I've talked about, and if there's any questions or thoughts, by all means, reach out. So I have no clue how long I went on. I hope I didn't go on too long. So with that, I'll say thank you to all of you and end there. Thank you.